Okay, where technology is working. Thank you for coming. We read Plato a few months ago, and maybe some people thought it was worthwhile, and so we're doing it again. And we're obviously doing a huge time warp now into the 19th century. And we're reading really the first American philosopher, right? The first really American thinker who thought about whether this country and sort of the American way of life requires a new kind of thinking. Maybe you know that he really inspired Walt Whitman, right, who is clearly a poet that would have not existed, in Germany or France. And so Emerson really kicked off something that is very American. So whether you've ever read Emerson or not, you'll probably find a lot of things in here that resonate simply because you're Americans. He's just like, Plato and Christianity have influenced our culture, whether you're a Platonist or a Christian, it's sort of around. I think in a similar way, Emerson is around. I don't want to say much more because I don't want to prefigure your reading. This is from the 1830s. Emerson was, in his mid-30s. He was born in 1803, I think. He was raised and served in the church. His first wife died. He had a major crisis of faith in many ways. And then he starts writing these essays that become extremely successful. He becomes a big hit on the sort of lecture circuit. He gave I just read this 1,500 lectures, in his life. He went to all these Chautauqua meetings. So he was really very influential in that way. He obviously was friends with Thoreau, whom you all know, I think, so he had a great influence. He also, started this, transcendentalist movement, it's called, to which he invited women, which at the time was, unusual. So Emerson really was a pretty extraordinary person. So I'm going to read the first few epigraphs, and then we'll jump right in. The first one is obviously in Latin, "Nete quesaviris extra," which means do not look outside of yourself, right? So don't search for things outside. And then come two English ones. "Man is his own star, and the soul that can render an honest and a perfect man commands all light, all influence, all fate. Nothing to him falls early or too late. Our acts, our angels are, or good or ill," which means for good or ill, "our fatal shadows that walk by us still." So that's one thing that he quoted, and I think the next one he might have just made up. "Cast the bantling on the rocks, suckle him with a she-wolf's teat, wintered with a hawk and fox, power and speed be hands and feet."
What's the bantling?
Little guy. So infant.
Oh.
Yeah. That's a tough love parenting. but it already speaks to the Emersonian confidence that human beings are tough, and they don't need to be helicoptered and coddled, but they need to be out there with a hawk and fox, and then they will have power and speed, rather than, Emerson would say, too many concerns and worries.
Like the founders of Rome.
Yes, very much so. Exactly. You'll be like Romulus. Any other sort of just initial thoughts or questions? I mean, that's how he sets the scene for this essay.
So what was his education? How did he come into this?
So he was a Unitarian minister for a while. He was extremely well educated. And he was an American, right? And he really so he was educated in the European tradition and then steeped in it. He loved his Goethe and his Plato and his Shakespeare. And so he grew up in that, but then he lives in this country that is so open and forward striving, and that tension between having one leg in Europe and the other one, at least on the intellectual frontier, is what makes Emerson such an interesting thinker. Yeah, so that's so maybe his background. So he's religious, but he is religious in a way that every sort of new age person nowadays would recognize, but which was at the time pretty radical. Yeah. Elaine, you want to read the first paragraph and
Sure.
go into it?
Essay 2, Self-Reliance. I read the other day some verses written by an eminent painter, which were original and not conventional. The soul always hears an admonition in such lines, let the subject be what it may. The sentiment they instill is of more value than any thought they may contain. To believe your own thought, to believe that what is true for you in your private heart is true for all men, that is genius. Speak your latent conviction, and it shall be the universal sense. For the inmost in due time becomes the outmost. And our first thought is rendered back to us by the trumpets of the last judgment. Familiar as the voice of the mind is to each, the highest merit we ascribe to Moses, Plato, and Milton is that they set at naught books and traditions and spoke not what men, but what they thought. A man should learn to detect and watch that gleam of light which flashes across his mind from within, more than the luster of the firmament of bards and sages. Yet he dismisses without notice his thought because it is his. In every work of genius, we recognize our own rejected thoughts. They come back to us with a certain alienated majesty. Great works of art have no more affecting lesson for us than this. They teach us to abide by our spontaneous impression with good-humored inflexibility than most when the whole cry of voices is on the other side. Else, tomorrow, a stranger will say with masterly good sense precisely what we have thought and felt all the time, and we shall be forced to take with shame our own opinion from another.
So I think he's sort of a great locker room philosopher because he's very inspiring, I think. And he's also lyrical, but he is trying to inspire people, obviously, to be self-reliant rather than Moses, Plato, Milton reliant.
And that's Thoreau too, right?
That is absolutely Thoreau, and it's Whitman as well. Emerson somewhere else has this great line. I don't think it's in here. He says, "We've Shakespeareized long enough. Now we need to write in our own American idiom." And so what he admires about people like Moses, Plato, and Milton is that they also didn't parrot what other people before them said. And so then Emerson says, well, then we ought to do that too. Right? If we want to be as great as Moses and Plato and Milton, then we got to sort of, as he says, right, speak that which is true for us. And yeah.
So would he dismiss the model of Jesus Christ?
He would, in another essay, he would add Jesus to the Moses, Plato, and Milton line. And he gave a famous speech at Harvard Divinity School when he said, we should not be followers of Jesus. We should be Jesus. And then Harvard Divinity School said, yeah, don't come back. So he does say the same thing, which is radical in many ways, right? But I'm told that Jesus said, you will do greater things than I. And so Emerson takes that very seriously, right? About that divine that is in everybody. And if it is in everybody, then Emerson would say, well, then you got to live that out. So don't follow this Jesus character around any more than you follow Plato or Milton or Moses around. Be as great as that person. So that's, of course, what, so that's where we can either say, wow, that's inspiring, or we can say, ooh, this is dangerous. Right? So Emerson is certainly radical in that way. Right? A man should learn to detect and watch that gleam of light which flashes across his mind from within, right? Which is right in the middle of that first paragraph. Right? So that light that flashes from within through our mind, that's what we should say, according to Emerson. Because he has the confidence that if we are true to that which is within, it's gonna be divine stuff, right? Because man has his own star, as he quoted at the beginning, right? We shouldn't search outside of ourselves. It's all there already, is what he says. So if you're a fan of the total depravity doctrine of man, then Emerson is not for you, right? He does not share that view one bit. If you think that man is fallen and very flawed, then I think Emerson would also push back against that. He doesn't think we can walk on water, but he thinks we have what it takes inside. Are there any sort of thoughts, questions just on the first paragraph? The nice thing about this essay is we might not get to the whole thing, but he really sort of it's like a Bach fugue. It's variations on a theme, right? So we have almost everything that he's now going to develop over the next 15, 16 pages.
Reaches rock bottom of depravity on their own. He should like that, because they're not seeking themselves outside themselves.
So this does not work. Well, he talks about this later too, right? So for example, he says later, well, if you take this idea to justify, stealing and robbing and these kind of things, say, well, I'm just doing what my inner genius tells me. He says, I'm not talking to you. Right. So that's going to be something that he has to really work out, because one could read this as sort of an invitation to do whatever you want. And so that's going to be important, that it has to be that gleam of light flashing across the mind from within, not some, testosterone infused, desire that you follow. And Emerson's going to have to make that clear over the course of the essay.
Working on a minute. The bolded line there, to believe your own thought, to believe that what is true for you in your own private heart is true for all men. That's genius. I feel like it's almost paradoxical, or there's like a tension within, because on the one hand, if you are believing that what is true for you is true for everybody, that's like a position for people thinking for themselves. But at the same time, if you believe that what is true for everybody, that could also be dangerous in that, you think people need to adapt to your own way. I suppose in the context of the rest of what he's saying, it's more clear, what it really means. But I just thought that was interesting.
No, you're right. It could have some sort of imperialist, overtones maybe, but Emerson has the confidence that just like the light and the genius that exists in you exists in everybody, right? So if you say that, it should resonate with everybody. And so it'll become clear, I think, and we can read Emerson charitably or not, and it's all good, right? You can do whatever you want. If you don't read it charitably, then you could say, come on, that's, you're mansplaining, or you're doing whatever it is, right? You are just imposing. If you read him charitably, you say, oh yeah, right? If we're all human beings, right? We all share in nature. We all are made in the image. We all have that same thing within. So if you say it in your own way, it should resonate with me. And I think that's why we like Moses, Plato, Milton, and all of that, because they do express something that resonates with people who are very, very different. But you're right. Yeah, that is them fighting words in many ways, right? And they ought to be pushed back against, I think. Mike, do you want to read the next paragraph? It gets even. I mean, this is all good stuff.
There is a time in every man's education when he arrives at the conviction that envy is ignorance, that imitation is suicide, that he must take himself for better, for worse, as his portion. That though the wide universe is full of good, no kernel of nourishing corn can come to him but through his toil, bestowed upon that plot of ground which is given to him to till. The power which resides in him is new in nature, and none but he knows what that is which he can do, nor does he know until he has tried. Not for nothing, one face, one character, one fact makes much impression on him, and another none. This sculpture in the memory is not without pre-established harmony. The eye was placed where one ray should fall, that it might testify of that particular ray. We but half express ourselves and are ashamed of that divine idea which each of us represents. It must be safely trusted as proportionate and of good issues, so it be faithfully imparted, but God will not have his work made manifest by cowards. A man is relieved and gay when he has put his heart into his work and done his best. But what he has said or done otherwise shall give him no peace. It is a deliverance which does not deliver. In the attempt, his genius deserts him. No muse befriends, no invention, no hope.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so those are also strong words. I've always really loved that first long sentence in the second paragraph. Because it's really important that cipher lines happens in a time in every person's education, right? It doesn't happen to a 6-year-old, right? You're not cipher line when you're 60, but this happens to people who are educated, right? Who've read all this stuff. And at some point you come to realize, I don't want to just copy Shakespeare. I don't just want to copy Emerson. I don't want to just copy Jesus, right? I want to be who I am. And I think, so that's where Emerson is read differently by different people, right? Some people read Emerson and say, "Oh, great! I don't have to do homework anymore," right? It's all nonsense. I read Emerson as somebody who says, when you've read Moses, Plato, Milton, and all of that, you've really worked through this. At some point, you realize, now I got to do my own thing. I got to speak my own true words, right? I can't just imitate Moses, Jesus, and the guys, right? I must take myself, for better or for worse, as my portion, right? I am who I am, and I have to live that out, is what Emerson would say. And then I do love that in the third line down, he says that though the wide universe is full of good, no kernel of nourishing corn can come to him, but through his toil bestowed on that plot of ground, which is given to him to till. You can't live somebody else's life, right? And some people might have a better plot of ground, right? Some people are smarter and better and what have you. And then you can either envy them or imitate them, or you can say, well, I've got this. That's all I got.
The age of independence, when people were trying to be on their own. It's like 30 or 40 years after independence from England, Britain.
Right.
I love the phrase in the paragraph called the sculpture in the memory.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't quite understand that. I was hoping someone would.
It was saying what you've seen with past, rays of light fall on things. It's there in your head, but you don't have to just use that only. But it's a sculpture in your memory. I like that. It's beautiful.
And it's not without pre-established harmony, right? There is something.
Harmony is there.
Exactly, right? So this again is very Platonic, right? You can tell that Emerson, he didn't make it in the church, even the Unitarian church, because he clearly is not an original sin subscriber, right? And so he thinks there's goodness there.
Yeah, that's the thing I noticed is that, and we're moving more towards that creation as blessing stance as a mainline church. And that is kind of where he is. It's like,
He was already there before we were.
yeah.
200 years earlier, almost.
So they kicked him out at that point, but we might really embrace him these days.
I agree, yeah.
That's where Waldo comes from. Where's Waldo? Not what would Jesus do, but what would Waldo do?
Yeah. Right, he says, the eye was placed where one ray should fall, that it might testify of that particular ray. Right, so we are all sort of placed in a particular context, and we are who we are. And we're going to see things in a certain way. And our job is to testify to what we truly see. And that is what Emerson says is everybody's job. And then when you say that, you're not going to say exactly the same thing. And I think that's what you pointed out in Mike earlier. It's not that when I say what I see, that's exactly the same thing that Terry says, but then maybe it sort of resonates with Terry in a certain way. She's, oh, I see things like this. Right? And now you can actually have a real interesting conversation, right? If people do that, because then they speak their truth. And now you're in business, right? I mean, now you're not having superficial conversations, and you're speaking the truth that you were sort of placed to testify to, is what he would say.
It does kind of seem like an invitation to or a kind of a laying the groundwork for beloved community, right? Like you can welcome any person who comes in because you know they are going to have their own particular ray of light they can testify to. And it reminds me when we worked with the adults with disabilities as part of the large Catholic charity, and that was kind of the philosophy too, that no matter our ability or disability, each person had a gift to offer the community.
And their presence enriches each other.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah. Every presence that is authentic, right? Is another word that Emerson doesn't use much. We would use this language now, right? If you authentically express what is true according to how you see the world, then you're making a contribution, right? That is sincere, that is true, and it has something to add to everybody else. And then we are relieved and gay, right? Because we have put our heart into our work and we've done our best, he says at the end of that paragraph. So what else could you want, right? But what he has said or done otherwise shall give him no peace, right? When you're just parroting what other people say, it's ultimately not satisfying. Right? It's not peace-giving. Even if it's true, right? He's got a great line later on when he says, yeah, for those people, when they say 2 + 2 is 4, it's not true. And so you sort of have to, you really have to know it. You really have to own that. Terry, you want to go on with the next one? Yeah.
Trust thyself. Every heart vibrates that iron string. Accept the place the divine providence has found for you, the society of your contemporaries, the connection of events. Great men have always done so and confided themselves childlike to the genius of their age, betraying their perception that the absolutely trustworthy was seated at their heart, working through their hands, predominating in all their being. And we are now men and must accept in the highest mind the same transcendent destiny, and not minors and invalids in a protected corner, not cowards fleeing before a revolution, but guides, redeemers, and benefactors, obeying the almighty effort and advancing on chaos and the dark. What pretty oracles nature yields us on this text in the face and behavior of children, babes, and even brutes that divided and rebel, is it rebel or rebel?
So it's an adjective, yeah, the rebel mind.
Rebel mind, that distrust of a sentiment because our arithmetic has computed the strength and means opposed to our purpose. These have not. Their mind being whole, their eye is as yet unconquered. And when we look in their faces, we are disconcerted. Infancy conforms to nobody. All conform to it, so that one babe commonly makes 4 or 5 out of the adults who prattle and play to it. So God has armed youth and puberty and manhood no less with its own piquancy and charm, and make it enviable and gracious, and its claims not to be put by, if it will stand by itself. Do you think the youth has no force because he cannot speak to you and me? Hark, in the next room, his voice sufficiently clear and emphatic. It seems he knows how to speak to his contemporaries, bashful or bold. Then he will know how to make us seniors very unnecessary.
Yeah. So yeah, this is sort of American forward-looking thinking, right? It's like, yeah, to heck with what, happened 5 minutes ago or 50 years ago or what have you. So yeah, this is very much a forward-looking kind of philosophy, and he thinks it's all here, right? And right now is where we have to be and speak and act and all the rest of it. So I don't know if you find this inspiring or crazy, but it's sort of a little bit of everything, isn't it? That it does, like, especially for someone like me, right? I work with young people and say there's some stuff back there that's really important. And Emerson seems to say, just do what I want. Yeah.
To me, this touches on what Pastor Rick said this morning,
Mhm.
of hearts, minds, hearts, and hands.
Mhm.
And that's you. That's where we are.
Mhm. I mean, I do love that end of that first paragraph that Terry read, right? So we are guides, redeemers, benefactors, obeying the almighty effort, advancing in chaos in the dark, right? So that the hero's journey in the intellectual world, and it's true, right? There's chaos in the dark out there, always, and our job is to advance on it, right? And hold up light and order against the forces of chaos and darkness. And we can't do it by, sitting in our armchair and reading Moses and Plato and Milton. We still have to see what is the pressing issue right now and right here, and how can I advance on it rather than hide myself in my favorite books. Although, just like Pastor Rick said, it's really fun to stay in the mind, and I certainly read my books.
Seems though that we need to learn from our past. I mean, if we don't heed some of the lessons, then how do we know where to go? We might repeat them.
That's the sculpture of the memory.
May that is one answer, but Kathleen's point is absolutely well taken. I mean, part of Emerson lends itself to say, let's not bother with the past.
I was, that last sentence, I mean, that absolutely disputes Indian beliefs that the elderly are that we need to listen to our elders.
That's right. And if you read the first sentence of the next paragraph, the nonchalance of boys who are sure of a dinner and would disdain as much as a lord to do or say ought to conciliate one is the healthy attitude of human nature. I don't know, right? If you've dealt with a teenage boy, I don't know if you would call that the healthy attitude of human nature. So you're right. This is where Emerson. So then again, we can either say, all right, Emerson, I know you spent decades reading Shakespeare and Plato and did all these kind of things, and now you're applying what you learned to a new situation, a new country. So you clearly don't think this stuff is nonsense. Or we can say, wow, Emerson, you're telling me I don't matter just because I'm, over 60 or what have you. So yeah, I mean, some people read Emerson and disregard the past and the elders. So that's where Emerson is. Yeah.
That's where it splits.
So you can read them either way. I mean, I do go back to this, first line of the second paragraph, that this happens at a time in every person's education, right? And so then you are actually an adult, and then you're trying to go back to this nonchalance of boys where you're saying, oh, I'm just doing this because I think this is right. I'm 50 years old, I'm 60 years old, I'm 80 years old, but I am approaching this issue like there's no tomorrow, like there was no yesterday.
Right.
Which is really what all the great people do. Right? You say, I'm fully in this action right here, no consideration of anything else. And because I've learned from the past, I can do that. I don't think Emerson is saying, turn the presidency over to some, sixth grader. It sounds like that. Sometimes, yes. So I don't think he would approve of that. I mean, nothing that Emerson sort of does or says in general suggests it, but his language goes there. His language is trying to make you, trying to push against maybe the self-satisfied seniors who say, well, I know everything just because I'm older. Yeah. Not you, but.
But I wonder if, since you spent time with Emerson, and I wonder if you've come to some kind of understanding with him, like why he uses extreme language. Do you think it, do you know what I mean? Because it is kind of, he's places. Is he doing it because he's speaking to in complacent times, or do you think he's actually convinced?
He's doing it because he's trying to upset the man. Right? I mean, he's talking to a society. I mean, think about 1830s America or anywhere where there's a bunch of old guys, who are in charge. Right? I mean, all the presidents and governors and church leaders, and they're all old white guys. And Emerson is absolutely, and Emerson, so that kind of seniority needs to be pushed, right? It needs to be overthrown. So it's not the seniority of wisdom, but it's the seniority of a sort of a calcified system that is holding sort of beautiful things hostage, right? If you think about the church, how that can become an organization in which the senior leaders are actually keeping the real thing away, right? And the children are saying, no, I want the real thing. And that attitude is what Emerson would approve of. So that's how I would read him.
Yeah, it seems like it's mostly sort of positioned against substituting what's in you with what's outside. Like, so whether it's seniors or whatever, when you're replacing, or when there's influences trying to get you to replace what you already have or want to say, or your light, or however you want to say it, with an outside thing. That's like a primary cost of his argument against that.
I think it's kind of cool that he's almost like giving everyone like really true respect. Like, if you will, you need to go and study the stuff. You need to create the sculpture of memory, right? But once you do, don't take what you read as the truth. Actually, what do you say about that? Instead of taking it as it is, like, learn it all, understand what was going on, what the context is, what was happening. Don't take it as truth. Take what you feel about it as truth, like your expression is truth.
Yeah. And I think Emerson would have the confidence that if you do that, you're actually speaking the truth.
Yeah.
Right? Because we're all sort of made the same way, and we all resonate to the same capital T truths. We do have to say it in our own way. So Emerson would have the confidence that if you say that, what comes out is never going to be some sort of, let's build, some concentration camps, right? Or let's kill a bunch of people. That's the truth that I'm hearing. And Emerson says, well, try again, right? You're not listening well enough. But you're right. It's going to have to be your own thing. I think about artists, right? You can't just spend your entire life just copying other artists, right? That's how you start. And it's how you need to start. But at some point, your art is going to have to be your art. And then it will be true, even though it's going to look different from everybody else's art. So and when you look at it as a paradigm for creating your own art, it sort of maybe rubs people less the wrong way. If you apply it to morality and all these kind of things, maybe some people find it disconcerting, but yes, then you have to read it with the Emersonian confidence in what you call the blessed creation, right? In which case you wouldn't be worried about people saying what they really, really, truly think and mean. Because if they're blessedly created and they're expressing that, there shouldn't be something horrible coming out If it does, well, then they're not in tune with, who they truly are. Then you got to go back to Moses, Plato, Milton, and tune yourself, right, and learn from that. Do you want to read another paragraph? And yeah.
The nonchalant boys who were sure of a dinner and would disdain as much as a lord to do or say ought to consider you one, with the healthy attitude of human nature. A boy is in the parlor what the pit is in the playhouse, independent, irresponsible, looking out from his corner on such people and facts as pass by. He tries and sentences them on their merits in the swift summary way of boys, as good, bad, interesting, silly, eloquent, troublesome. He cumbers himself never about consequences, about interests. He gives an independent, genuine verdict. You must court him. He does not court you, but the man is, as it were, clapped into jail by his consciousness. As soon as he has once acted or spoken with eclat, he is a committed person, watched by the sympathy or the hatred of hundreds, whose affections must now enter into his account. There is no lead for this, that he could pass again into his neutrality. Who can thus avoid all pledges and having observed, observe again from the same unaffected, unbiased, unbribable, unaffrighted innocence, must always be formidable. He would utter opinions on all passing affairs, which be seen to be not private, but necessary, would sink like darts into the ear of men and put them in fear.
Yeah, so he wants you to just say what you think, right? Boom. And then if the next day you think something else, then you say that. Right? And you don't get sort of, so he is anti-creed, as you can tell, right? He wouldn't want you to say, oh, because I said that, 2 weeks ago, now I have to be consistent with that. So you speak whatever you want. Boom. You make an independent, genuine verdict, because at this point, that's how you see it.
What's eclat?
Panache with scandal, with, just, yeah, power.
And leaf?
The river Lethe, right? Forgetfulness. There's no passing through the river, right? Where you forget all things.
Is that
The river Lethe in Greek mythology.
Oh,
Yeah. Do you know that the Greeks called truth aletheia, right? The unforgetting. So lethe is forgetting things. And when you cross over, you forget everything in the past. And then truth is an unforgetting. And Emerson, I think, would relate to that as well, right? So that deep down we know all this stuff because we're made from this and in this. And so just say it. And then if it turns out to be wrong, what you said, oh, well, let you try again. And I think this is something that I find interesting, right? That sometimes we don't want to say something because we're afraid we haven't fully understood this, and so we hold back. And that's probably fine. But Emerson would say, well, what of it? Why don't you just say it right now? You can always revise. And you can always rethink what you've said before. But we're all sort of clapped in jail, right, by being conscious of having, being Episcopalians or being this or being that, right? And so we want to be consistent. And Emerson would say, well, you're changing, right? Everything's changing. So just be like a boy who's sure of a dinner.
I think in some ways that's almost like the disease of our time. Like is this idea that, we have to, if you speak something, you have to be wedded to the truth.
Mhm.
I mean, wedded to the consistency of the truth. It's like we say stuff and then we have to say it again because we said it instead of like, my goodness, like every decade for me is a completely different change of perception of what I think about. We'll say stupid things like there's no, it's ridiculous to think that what I thought when I was a teenager is the same thing I thought when I was in the 20s. That's not the truth for me. So I just think it's interesting that we want it to be better. We want to find find a truth that stuff we want to keep repeating that because we found something.
Yeah.
That we can kind of anchor ourselves to instead of being able to do what he's, which is always good. Kind of come back to it with a fresh view. And is it actually true or not?
That's what Pastor Rick said this morning about the church having to change. But then I worry about it in the law, because our common law, which comes from the British common law, once the law is established, then we continue it and we may amend it, but we don't just overthrow it. It was overthrown recently, and that's something that's uncomfortable for many, because it's going ahead, but there's nothing what's sacred anymore.
I mean, this is where, is he a political thinker? I don't know. I think he's more of a spiritual thinker about how you need to act. You can only do what he is saying, I think, in a society that has rules and laws. Right? So, but on the third hand, he probably would agree with Jefferson, who said, yeah, we gotta, rewrite the Constitution every generation, which sounds radical to us. So that's an interesting question, right? So again, Emerson, I think if you read him as speaking to artists, you don't have to worry. Sure, it makes sense for artists. If you think about it as an individual on a spiritual journey, that sounds fine too. If you then apply them to, government, how would that work? And maybe it's not written for government, right? This is for people who want to be self-reliant in a system where they don't have to worry about, having people come with clubs and beating their heads in or stealing their stuff. Yeah, because then in a society like this, you couldn't even be self-reliant, right? Because you're constantly worried about survival. So you're right. I mean, I don't think the Supreme Court justice, you use this to make your decisions. Yeah.
Right, I'm fascinated because I keep thinking context makes all the difference.
Mm.
And yet regardless of the context, there is that day, that age, those people, the way they're thinking.
Mhm.
There is some nugget that continues to be truth, continues to be that spotlight of light. But it's very hard to find because the context, the clouds come, the fog comes, and we get confused by all the noise that is around us. This is very interesting. Take the different contexts in my own life.
Yeah.
And how they've affected the way I think truth appears.
Right.
So it's a continual work.
You're probably all familiar with, Plato's cave analogy, right? Where you're sort of born and the context determines what you think. Right? People tell you this is true, this is not true, da 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 da. And at some point you have to break out of it. And right, especially a teenager, you think what your parents tell you. Right? I mean, the students last year wore masks, were the students whose parents told them to wear a mask. And the students who didn't wear a mask were the students whose parents told them not to wear a mask. So you don't take it personally as a teacher if a kid shows up with or without a mask. But at some point you have to break out of that contextually determined point of view and find what's really, really true. Yeah. And I think, so part of why he's so radical is because he wants to overcorrect, right? So people who are timid, people who are following doctrine, right? People who just want to maintain this because it's good enough for grandpa, right? He wants to push people in the other direction. And then he is aware that what he's saying could be misappropriated. And he calls them bold sensualists who want to gild their crimes with his philosophy, who just say, well, I'll do whatever I want. So that's where Emerson was saying, well, that's not what I'm talking about. And so, yeah, but also Emerson's context is one of a world that we wouldn't want to live in. I think 1830s America, certainly not if you're female or black or anything, but privileged and male and white. So he's pushing against that with a lot of ammo, and he is trying to upset the sacred cows of his times.
Interesting to think about Emerson in connection with the insurrection at the Capitol. Think about what's wrong, what went wrong with that way of thinking that allowed those people to go in and desecrate the Capitol, basically,
Mm.
because of their sense that it was right. You know, it's like, what's wrong with that picture, you know?
Yeah,
Are they? I mean, are they? The impression I get is those people are not following their own personal intuition. The large part of why they're doing what they're doing is because they're being led by somebody they want to kind of, abandon their own self-responsibility or abnegate that, to do what this other person tells them to do because it makes them feel confident or whatever. Probably a whole lot of reasons. I mean, I don't know, that's just the impression I get, but.
That's a good point.
the man from Ohio who spoke at the January 6 hearings, right, who went to the Capitol, he made exactly Mike's point, right? He said, I had sort of an echo chamber of news, right? And I followed that. And I wasn't thinking for myself. I was ordered to show up. So I showed up and somebody yelled, let's go this way. So I went that way. So he, as a participant who then later woke up to it, would say, I was the opposite of self-reliant. I was
Does he really
following.
believe that, or is he just trying to get off the hook?
I mean, if you watch that testimony, it was really powerful.
Well, I did, but I didn't know how truthful it could be.
Yeah.
Or then.
Yeah, that's fair to say. Yeah, we don't know. And I think he got 2 years probation or so. But I think Emerson does not lend himself to mob action. Almost by definition, right? That cannot be a self-reliant act, right? If you're standing with a bunch of people and you're saying, follow the leader. That doesn't really work with self-reliance. I think self-reliance is a good check actually against mass action and mass hysteria.
Chaos and dark.
Yeah.
That is in some sense, that we have to advance against that. Yeah. So I think of this more like, tank man, right? You all remember that picture in 1989 of the Chinese young man who stood with his grocery bags, who stood in front of the line of tanks at Tiananmen Square. That's self-reliant action. The guys in the tanks, they were ordered to go and, show strength. Exactly. Yeah. And so then if you do utter your opinions like that, they would sink like darts into the ear of men, right? You're going to say uncomfortable things and maybe quite a few stupid things too, but that's fine, right? So I think among self-reliant people, if somebody says something that's offensive, it's not offensive. It's like, well, wait a minute, let's talk about that. So I think he doesn't want to be concerned. So another thing that doesn't work with Emerson is political correctness, obviously, right? Because he's just going to say whatever he wants. And so if you're worried about offending people, then Emerson also isn't your guy.
But if you're willing to be offensive to people and yet open to be educated, that's different.
Exactly. And no, entirely, right? Because you give and take, right? And if you say whatever you think, of course, you have to be willing to have people say whatever they think. And if they think that you're full of it and they tell you, then you would say, oh, that's very interesting.
Experience,
Exactly.
and you're not aware of it, so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's 11:17. I don't know that we could obviously spend hours here, but I'm sure you all have things to do. Is that fair if we call it a day for now, or? Yeah,
We'll pick up the next time.
yeah, we'll pick up, and maybe I'll take us to a few sections because we're obviously not going to get through the whole thing at this pace. But I'll point out some things that I think are maybe new, sort of additional to this. There's a lot of repeat, but I'll point out a few things, and if you want to bring up things as well, then you can certainly do that.